I was there for the birth of the Antichrist. Of course, I didn't know it was the Antichrist when I arrived at the house. I had been hired to take some photos. Nothing unusual there. I'm a wedding photographer by trade, but times are hard. I'll take any job, and you'd be surprised what sort of stuff people will pay you to capture. I'd never been booked for a birth before, but a job's a job, isn't it? They were birthing at home. I didn't ask why. My wife had our boy in the hospital, insisted she wouldn't have anything for the pain, but quite understandably she noped out after a few hours of contractions and had an epidural. I didn't really know how it would work at home, but I was pretty sure that an epidural wouldn't be an option, so whoever the mother was, I figured she was one brave lady. I pulled into the drive and was instantly glad to have taken the job. The place was huge, like an actual mansion. I charged them my standard wedding rate, but I just knew these guys would be good tippers. The first photos ever of their kid drawing their first breaths in the world. I was going to make some money, no doubt about it. You'd think the house they chose for the birth of the Antichrist would be like a horror movie set, wouldn't you? But it wasn't. There was nothing creepy about it, on the outside at least. Aside from its size, it was pretty normal. Whitewashed, freshly cut lawns, a couple of those big bushes that they trimmed into animal shapes. One was a crouching tiger, I think, and one was a wolf or maybe a dog, like a German shepherd. It was hard to tell. I mean, it was made out of fucking leaves. When I rang the doorbell, a man very quickly opened the door with a huge smile on his face. He had a black suit on as if he was going to a funeral, and his face was super white. And this is coming from a white man. He was pasty. His hair was jet black. His teeth were somehow even whiter than his skin, and I figured he must have had some sort of cosmetic cleaning or bleaching regime, or a skin problem. Either way, I figured he could afford to look weird because he was rich. He introduced himself as Mercurio, and held out his hand, which I shook. He was wearing white gloves. He ushered me inside, and thanked me for coming, told me to come upstairs with him. The hallway looked as normal as the hallway of a mansion can look to a guy like me who lives paycheck to paycheck, but I noticed it was lit up by candles. It was daytime, but I realised that all the curtains were closed, so no light was coming in the windows. The candles were all red, in silver sticks that were mounted evenly up the sides of the staircase, which was in the middle of the hallway. Mercurio was halfway up and beckoning me to follow, so I did. I didn't count the stairs, but there were a lot. I went up 3 flights, all with the same red candles mounted on the walls at either side before I ended up in front of a closed red door. 2 people, I couldn't see if they were men or women on account of the red, hooded robes they wore, stood at either side of it. Mercurio was still grinning and asked me if I was ready to do the job I was being paid for. I told him I was. He asked if I'd brought the Polaroid camera with the flash, and I said yes, of course. Now that I'd seen how terrible the lighting was, I was glad they'd insisted on it. He opened the door and gestured for me to go in. The door closed behind me and I realised that Mercurio hadn't followed. When my eyes got used to the darkness, I saw there were 6 more red-robed people on either side of what I assumed was a bed in front of me. But it had kind of a red draped thing at the foot of it, so I couldn't see who was in it. I stood there and put my hands behind my back because it seemed like a respectful thing to do. After a while, I guess maybe 10 minutes or so without anyone instructing me or speaking or making any noise at all, I decided to poke my head around the curtain to see what the fuck was happening. It was a bed, and a naked woman lay there, ankles and wrists tied to the corners of the frame. She was clearly very heavily pregnant. I didn't take much in about how she looked before I turned away from her in shock and disgust. I looked around at the hooded people for an explanation, but they didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. I said to one of the hoods that I wasn't cool with this, and that I was going to call the police. They stayed silent. I moved to go and open the door to leave, but found it was locked. I pulled my phone out to call someone or send a message or something, anything, but it wasn't working. It was definitely charged because it showed up the no service message at the top of the screen. The wallpaper with my kid and I posing outside the museum just wasn't there. The screen was completely black except for the message. I unlocked it to dial and put on a speaker so these weirdos knew I was serious, but there was no dial tone. This weird noise was coming out of it, like someone breathing really fast, a bit like a dog that's too hot, but even faster. I don't know how I knew, but I knew it wasn't any dog. I dropped my phone when the woman screamed and I looked at her. Her whole body was straining. She was pushing. She was giving birth, and all the while she had this look on her face. Not of pain, what she must have been in, but sadness. She looked like there was no hope left in the whole world. The hoods were all staring at me. Well, I guess they were. I still couldn't see their faces, but they had all turned toward me. I realised they were waiting for me to start doing my job. "Jesus Christ," I said. "You want me to take pictures of this?" They said nothing, but all turned back to look at the poor, grunting, sweating woman on the bed. When I took the job, I thought I'd be taking pictures of a newborn baby and his smiling mother, not some slave being forced to push out a child. I had no choice. I was here and I was trapped, and whilst I didn't know what the hell was going on, I figured that if I was going to get out of there, it was by doing what they said they would pay me to do. So, God help me, I started snapping. I don't know how long the whole thing took, but the camera flashed and I just let the Polaroid spill out onto the floor. I had to change the film at some point, which took longer than it should have because I was sweating and so terrified that if I took too long, something awful would happen to me, that I kept fumbling it. When the baby started to come out of her, I was in a daze, as if the situation wasn't quite real. Not exactly like a dream, just like I was watching events unfold from far away. I could see that the baby was red. It was covered in her blood, but I could see that its skin was crimson underneath. The woman had started to shrink, as if she was aging before my eyes. Her hair had started to grey and her limbs were getting thinner and thinner as the red baby emerged further. Soon she was near skeletal, and her eyes, now completely white, had shrunken into their sockets as she withered away, and her screams were now no more than feeble rasps and croaks. I looked one final time at the baby, and saw its little red hands grip the bedclothes, and it started to pull. It pulled itself out of her, face down onto the bed. As its legs came free, its mother, a living husk, let out a tiny pained squeak, and the thing lifted up its red, wet head before its eyes locked mine. I saw hell reflected in them, and I understood then exactly what I was looking at. It knew every lie I'd ever told, my every fear, my every dirty dream, and every sin and secret. I felt nothing but overwhelming, indescribable horror, and I began to scream, the hopeless scream of the damned, because it was all I could do. So helpless was I in that moment, looking at this thing that had come up from the abyss to rob my very soul of its mysteries from the inside out. I don't remember anything else after that moment. I was just home, alone, with no knowledge of how I'd made it back. I was almost too scared to check my bank balance, but sure enough, the money was there with a very generous tip on top. It was my blood money, my pieces of silver. I'm in their service now, and I know I can't leave it. I've been marked, and that thing will see me wherever I go on this earth. I understand now why the woman looked so utterly lost. She knew what she was bringing into this world, and where she was going for her troubles. My camera was gone, not that I couldn't afford a new one, but in my inside jacket pocket they'd left me with one single Polaroid. It was from somewhere midway through the birth. The woman didn't look too emaciated yet, and the baby's head seemed to only just be crowning. The hooded figures were there too, but behind them, at the head of the bed, something else. Another figure, only barely visible in the darkness, that I swear wasn't standing there when I was in that room. It towered over the others, a giant with ruined feathery wings spread out behind it, arms outstretched by its sides. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking right at the lens, right at me. The photo wasn't some grim keepsake. It was how they let me know that the baby's father had not missed the birth, and that by taking the job, I'd made the worst, most dreadful deal a mortal man can make. There are a lot of names for the black dog up and down the country. The shuck, the padfoot, the trash and the barguest. It's said that you encounter it on lonely country roads at night. It's also said that if you do see it, you will meet your end within days. I was hiking across the moors with my friend John. We had pitched our tents up to camp in a secluded spot, just off the road in a small wood where I was waiting for him, cooking up some sausages in the pan while he was off gathering wood for us to make a fire before nightfall. I'd kept in contact with him by shouting. We knew not to go too far in case we got lost. The fog can roll in quickly out there, and before you know it, you're stuck in the middle of it, unable to see a few feet in front of you. So every few minutes he shouted David, and I shouted John back. I hadn't heard him shout for a few minutes, and then it came, a scream. I stood up and started shouting my friend's name into the trees, and soon I heard him crunching quickly over the sticks and twigs. He appeared in front of me with no wood. His face was white. He wouldn't speak for ages, looking like he'd seen a ghost. I gave him the bottle of whiskey I'd been nursing, and he necked some of it, and finally he told me. It had appeared from behind a tree, he said, this huge black dog. It was wet looking and had too many teeth in its mouth. Its eyes weren't dog's eyes, he said. They were human eyes. I asked him what it did, and he said it didn't really do anything. It just looked at him with those horrible eyes without making a sound. It hated me, he said. It wanted me to die. I tried to calm him down and tell him it was probably just a farmer's dog on the loose, but he shook his head. No, you didn't see it. He went into the tent after that and took the whiskey with him. I got up the next morning, and when he didn't come out of the tent after I called him a few times, I unzipped it and saw that he wasn't there. His coat was still in there, his backpack, and all his stuff including his shoes. I climbed out and shouted into the trees, but if he could hear me, he wasn't letting on. When I looked down, I saw something terrifying in the mud around the doorway of his tent. There were paw prints, massive ones like a lion had been in the camp, but the only other footprints were mine. If he wasn't responding to my calls because he couldn't, because he was unconscious or worse, then he needed proper medical attention, and I couldn't give that. I threw some belongings in my backpack and set off, leaving the tents behind so they wouldn't weigh me down. I walked, and every time I let myself stop for a breather, I started wondering why I didn't see his footprints walking away from the tent, and wondering if the paw prints were made by that dog he'd been talking about, the one with too many teeth. Then I looked up to see where the sun was, worried about how fast it was crossing the sky, and set off again. My feet were killing me, but eventually I saw the lights of the little town where we'd parked the car. It was pretty much dark now, but I reckoned I was going to make it back to the car before it got pitch black. There was a crossroads up ahead, I noticed, remembering it from when we'd walked past it on the way to pitch the tents. And then I stopped dead because there was something standing right in the middle of it. Something I almost hadn't noticed because of how dark the sky was. Because of how dark it was. It started trotting toward me, and I saw it was a great black dog. The closer it got, the more of its face I saw, and I realised John had really seen it after all. Its mouth was overflowing with sharp teeth, like some kind of messed up shark, drooling onto the ground. Its paws should have been slapping on the road. It was too big and heavy looking to not make a noise, but it didn't. There were no footsteps as it got closer, only silence. It stopped in front of me, and I looked at its eyes, petrified, and my blood ran cold. Human eyes looked back. I was more scared than I've ever been in my life in that moment, and I knew this wasn't a dog. It was a thing that looked like a dog. I dreaded to think what it really looked like. And then it was gone. I didn't see it leave, it just stopped being there. I was alone at the crossroads. In spite of my sore feet and exhaustion, I ran the last half hour back to town, and collapsed into the car and locked the doors. A couple of days later, and I'm back home in the city. I had to tell the police that John had gone missing, and they were understandably suspicious, but had gone to look for him. They had taken the mountain rescue helicopter out and everything. I don't think that they're going to find him. I'm alone in the flat, and I just woke up from this terrible dream where I was being torn to pieces by dogs. But I wouldn't die, even when my arms and legs and head were all over the place. I could still feel them chewing me up. As I come around, I notice, over on the other side of the room, a black silhouette against the curtains, triangular ears pricked up. It's huge, just like it was back at the crossroads. But this time, it's growling.
Season's greetings from the witch house, my friends. Make sure you shut your doors and keep them locked tonight. Santa's not the only one who does the rounds at this time of year. It Came Upon a Midnight Clear by Dr. Gallo. The kids were ecstatic at the prospect of snow on Christmas Eve. Helena, not so much. Summer in the Welsh valleys had been wonderfully verdant, full of lush greens among the dips and peaks by day, and the sultry air of night filled with bats flitting around the cottage eaves and the mystical hoots of owls. Autumn had been filled with the homely, glorious smell of leaf and wood smoke, as the locals raked up the season's golden brown debris and burned it, seemingly every day. Now it was winter and bitterly cold, with all but the hardiest greens now retreated until April returned to coax them back from the earth. It was dark when Helena drove her children to school, and dark when she picked them up again. Despite the few months she'd spent learning the roads, driving on them still made her nervous. She had found driving around the city a doddle for years, but the narrow valley roads had bends you couldn't see around for what felt like miles at a time. Sometimes they were slick with water draining from somewhere above, even when there had been no rain. Sometimes they were so steep you felt like you were almost defying gravity, whether you were heading up or down. But none of this was what agitated her as she stood in the kitchen, glass of Malbec in hand, staring out of the window into the blackness. It had been the butcher, and what he'd said as she picked up her turkey. She'd almost forgotten the days-old exchange until that morning when the man on the radio had forecast snow, and her mind turned back to that odd little moment in the village. "All ready for Christmas, love?" he'd boomed at her, taking her quite by surprise. "Oh, yes, we'll be all set when we get this bird in the oven. Do you think we'll get a white one?" The butcher paused and narrowed his eyes at her. "Snow's no good round here. Causes too many problems." "Yes, I suppose it would be quite easy to get snowed in." "We've not had snow on Christmas Eve since I was a boy. Must be going on nearly 40 years. "Was it bad?" she asked, unsure if she should have dared. His eyes weren't narrowed now, but the look he regarded her with was so intense that she wanted to leave the shop, and her bird, there on the counter. "It was bad," he told her, voice low as he continued to wrap up the turkey. "There's always a few old folks don't make it through the nights of winter, but there's more to it when it's Yuletide. But it wasn't just old folks didn't make it that year when I was a boy." "What do you mean?" she asked. "What happened?" A few folk went missing. Probably got lost in the snow. Never found them though." "Oh, how awful." "They were new to town. 2 couples. One had children who were about my age, say 5 or so at the time. They all arrived in the spring and summer, and on Christmas night they all vanished without a trace." "Did the police not get involved? I know it's remote around here, but surely they must have turned up some clues. Or bodies, or..." No, they found nothing, love. The house doors were open, but nobody was home. There were drifts starting in the hallways where the snow had got in.
Goodness.
Oh, you'll be fine, nothing to be afraid of. Just a lot of superstitious nonsense.
What was superstitious about it?
Oh, you know how these old villages are, full of folk tales. Don't worry your head about it. Just make sure you get to bed at a reasonable hour, lights out and all that. You don't want to put Santa off, do you?
He handed the turkey over to her with a smile, and she felt better.
Just remember to keep a rhyme in your heart come Christmas Eve. That's what my nana always told me. A rhyme will see you through.
Through what? She tittered nervously, but he simply tied up the plastic bag and pushed it over the counter.
That's £15 for the turkey, love. It'll feed you for days, that will.
As she stared at the all-encompassing blackness of the valley beyond the window and wondered what it all meant, the first fat, powdery flake of snow landed silently and stuck to the pane, brilliant white and hovering in the dark. Another followed, then another. Then, Jester the tabby cat announced his displeasure at the snow's intrusion by meowing loudly from outside the front door.
"Fuck," she whispered to the empty room.
She'd have to open the door and let him in, otherwise he'd freeze. A matter she would never have given a moment's thought if it hadn't been for that silly butcher telling her to keep the door locked. It briefly and horribly crossed her mind to let him stay out there anyway, but the thought shamed her as soon as it had passed. She wouldn't have forgiven herself, and neither would Tom or Peter, sleeping happily away upstairs. The idea of opening the house to the elements, to the darkness outside, was sending her anxiety through the roof, and she cursed the butcher inwardly for spooking her so carelessly. I'll just give it 5 minutes, she thought to herself. It might go off. 10 minutes later, the windows were mostly white, and the little patches of darkness she could still see were getting smaller by the second. There was no escaping this, she realised, and finally plucked up the courage to unlock the front door. She braced herself against the cold and whatever else she thought she might find and yanked it open swiftly. Jester meowed indignantly as he scurried inside, shaking off clumps of the white stuff all over the carpet as he went, and disappeared into the living room. Helena was about to shut the door again, but stopped when she saw the hoof prints. They went from left to right across the area just beyond the front door, and over the cat's trail, before vanishing into the darkness off to the side. She became aware of a noise amidst the quiet shushing of the trees in the breeze, something crunching against the icy earth beyond the light, something drawing closer. She did not dare look up to see what was coming toward her, so she just stared at the snow on the ground, unable to move. A voice, odd and frightening, came out of the dark as it approached.
"He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good, for goodness sake."
She kept her eyes firmly affixed to the increasing white carpet before her, and the bottoms of the thing's legs came into view. They were dark grey fur ending in hooves of deep mahogany. Black metal nails poked up bloodily through the edges of those hooves, as if the thing had been cruelly shoed by some disgraced and vile farrier. Helena shuddered violently out of fear and against the cold. She couldn't begin to make sense of what was happening. The voice came again.
"The game is forfeit if you run away. Perhaps you have a rhyme to play."
"Yes," she said feebly, as she began to vaguely understand. "I do. I have a rhyme. A rhyme for you." The creature gave a purring croak. Did that mean it was pleased? When it didn't speak, she took it as a prompt to continue. "It's Christmas Eve. My boys are sleeping. Please, don't let them hear me weeping."
"I like your style." I think I'm going to stay a while. Tell me what they call you here. Speak the truth, with little fear.
She noted the choice of words. It told her to speak with little fear, not none. It was still a threat. She was not safe, and neither were her children, and this thing wanted her to know it, delighting in her horror. They call me Hell, she started, and her mind went blank for a moment before the words started to flow again. They call me Hell about these parts. Creature, do you have no heart? I'm scared and wish to go inside. Truth be told, I'm terrified.
I know you are. I smell it on you. To question me will bring bad fortune. Know your place and speak politely, or I'll eat your children. They'll go down nicely.
Helena moaned, and the creature scraped a hoof into the snow several times, while it made a chortling sound. She hated it, this trespasser, with all her heart. It sang to her, awful and discordant.
I come from places you can't tread. My comfort is to feel your dread. I'll take your boys back down to hell, unless you rhyme along till 12.
Until 12. She had to last until 12. Was that 12 midnight, or another deliberately vague 12 that made it impossible to win? She tried to remember what time it was, and wished she'd left that second glass of wine in the bottle. She recalled that she'd checked the turkey not too long before Jester had wanted in, and she'd done so with the intention of going up to bed before the snow started. She was sure the clock on the oven had said it was 11:45. Suddenly, it took an impatient step toward her, and she let out a tiny shriek. My turkey's in the oven, dear. I hope it doesn't burn this year. It stepped back.
I hunger too, for meat, like you.
Oh, I would make a dreadful meal. Too thin, you see. Let's make a deal?
No deals. This is your final chance to save yourself from my cruel dance. Make me laugh before the bells, or come with me back down to hell.
Make it laugh. She despaired, for the situation was hopeless. This beast had come unbidden to menace her and her boys out of naught but spiteful, infernal tradition, and now it wanted her to tell it a fucking joke, and all was lost. What did demons laugh at anyway? Then, somehow, it made sense. She just had to find the right words. She tried to ignore the odd noises it made, and its impatience, and to ignore the all too fast passing of the seconds. They were distractions, and she knew that if she let them, they would mean a terrible end for her family. This was just pressure. She was used to it. She was good at dealing with it, and it counted now, more than ever. Helena sucked in a deep breath of freezing air. Beast, I think our dance is done. Your hooves would break my toes. If midnight means you go to hell, then do it all alone. That rhyme was not the best of mine, but now I get the joke. If you're still here at 12 o'clock, you're banished into smoke. Her eyes streamed against the cold air, in spite of which her brow was dripping sweat. There was a noise in front of her, a bestial grunt that sounded almost like a chuckle. The oven beeped as it did to mark every hour, and this time it beeped that it was Christmas Day. The faint odour of a struck match with burning hair wrinkled her nose, and was gone in the wind. Finally, she looked up and saw the trail of hoof prints, leading up to where the thing had stood, but the space was empty, and its prints already disappearing. She began to shake the snow from her hair as she allowed herself to move again and look around. To the left, over the brook that separated their properties, she saw the McGavin's house, and that their door was wide open, unable to close against the snow that now drifted against it in the hallway.
We all know not to go up to those woods at the edge of the mountains. We've always known. There have always been tales of not quite human things roaming around up there, and generally, if we don't bother them, they don't bother us. They've been spotted in the trees sometimes at night, but nobody ever hangs around long enough to get a good look. They're huge, ape-like beings that only come out in the dark. Their footprints have been found close to the outskirts of town, but not very often. They're big enough to pass for gorilla footprints, but there are no gorillas around here. A few years back, a couple came passing through town, said they were going camping. We told them not to, told them Bush Falls was prettier and safer, but they didn't listen. The young fellow laughed at us when we eventually told him that there was something up there, that the trail had gone bad. But off they went, and we watched them go, knowing it was up to God what happened next. We didn't hear anything for a full week, but then, one morning, Bessie opened up the diner, and that young fellow was conked out right there on the porch. He was a mess. His left arm was broken, twisted up all wrong, and his face was swollen like a purple melon where something had hit him. His left eye was closed shut, and half his teeth were gone, or broken down to nothing but little white splinters we saw once the doc had cleaned out some of the blood of his mouth. He woke up while we waited for an ambulance from the city to come and take him home. I half hoped he was going to tell us that the brakes on their car had failed, and that they'd come off the road into a tree, that maybe she was still out there waiting for help to arrive, but I knew better. Something had come to their camp, he said. The first 2 nights we heard it crunching around outside the tent, and we thought it was just a deer or maybe a bear. We packed up and moved on, and pitched up somewhere else to get out of its territory, then spent a day hiking to the lake. But when we got back, the whole site was ransacked. The tent was ripped to pieces, our food that we'd hung in the trees torn down, the bag that had our torches and medicine in it was gone. We got freaked out and headed back to the car, but that was all smashed up too. Windows shattered, mirrors pulled off. The hood was bent up and a tree branch had been jammed through the grill, and it was stuck right in the fucking engine. Nobody said anything. We started hiking back down the trail, but it got dark after a couple of hours, and we couldn't see, so we had to stop. I had a stick I thought I could fight some animal off with, so we tried to rest under some trees. Then whatever it was, it came in the middle of the night, roaring like a lion or a demon, and it hit me like a train. And I flew out of that clearing and landed in some bushes. Margot was screaming, but I couldn't see and I couldn't get up. The pain all up one side was so bad. She kept screaming while it carried her off. I heard its footsteps getting further away and I blacked out. Then I woke up and I couldn't hear her anymore. The room was deathly silent when he stopped talking, and he looked around at us all expectantly. "Did you hear what I said?" he asked. "There's a fucking monster out there, and it's got my wife." "We tried to warn you, son," I told him. "Nobody will be going back up there. I'm sorry." He tried to get up, but he groaned when the pain hit him. I figured his ankle wasn't right. Must have been Will alone that got him back down through the woods to town. "That's it. You're just going to leave her up there. Where's the sheriff?" Drury was standing in the doorway out of view of the young fellow, but he walked in at his cue. "I'm Bill Drury," he told him, "and my friend here is right. The first few hours are crucial if we're ever going to find someone alive. Nobody's coming back from a bear attack after all this time. All this way. And I'm sorry to tell you, but it's a fact." "That wasn't a fucking bear, and you know it," the young fella cried. "You all told me it was bad up there. You know what's up there. Why didn't I listen?" "Best you go home, son," said Drury, and there was no argument. The kid looked lost. As they bundled him into the ambulance, he swore he'd be back to find her with the authorities, but nobody came. They don't much care about communities out here, much less some unprepared city folk got themselves eaten by local wildlife. There are plenty of human bones up there. What's a few more? As far as I know, his car is still out there, years later. We certainly haven't been up to get it. There's a trapper who lives in town, Gurdon is his name, and he's about the only one who'll brave the woods much beyond where sight of the town gets scarce. He's seen his share of odd things out there, he told me one night over a beer as the first snowflakes started to blow around outside, and heard some strange things too. He'd been up there at the bottom of the mountain a little while after that young lady had gone missing, 10 months or so he reckoned, and he swore to me, right there and then, that from somewhere up high, among the ridges, he could hear a baby crying. There is a hidden place beyond the Rossebuurt that most visitors to Amsterdam never find. There is nothing to entice a casual tourist, sex or otherwise, down the darkened straats and alleys, or under those bridges that lead to it, away from the well-trodden paths. There is no sign above the door. It has no formal name, but to those who know of it, it has become known as Die Kamers voor de Onverschrokken, the chambers for the fearless. There you will find old and forgotten things among the rooms whose services you may purchase for the right price. Most who hear its name whispered never make it to the door. Most dismiss the possibility that it could even exist. Guides are scarce, even for the rich and curious. Locals will refuse to acknowledge it in the company of strangers, though nobody is sure whether this is because they are afraid, or out of some respect for some clandestine and long-standing covenant. Either way, customer discretion is completely assured. The canal water outside gleams red by night as the traditional lights in the windows shine across it. One lantern in each of the 4 windows at the front of the Grachtenpand. The door below the windows is metal, with 3 retractable slats, placed at equal thirds down the middle of it. Depending on your height, one of the slats will slide across at your approach and something on the other side will appraise you and your intention. If your intention is deemed worthy, and worthy is by no means the same as pure, the door will open and the dreadful, scintillating musk of 1,000 final ecstasies will engulf you, and then you will be inside and you must make your choice. All decisions are very, very final. There is Ilse, the she-wolf, who, when pressed, will declare angrily that she preceded the film of the same name by decades, and once a month will turn into a great, golden-haired bipedal hybrid of human and wolf. On this night alone, Ilse makes herself available. If one so desires, you may enter her chamber, a dungeon of stone, and approach her. If she likes you, you will have your way. If she does not, you will be rent limb from limb and eaten while your parts, all of them, are still warm. Such is the gamble of seeking her particular thrill, and you would be surprised by how many take the chance just to boast of having tamed such a wild and elemental being. Of course, Survivors would do well to make such boasts out of earshot of Ilse. Perhaps predictably there are vampires, the ones who have long since abandoned most of their humanity but still can't quite get over the need to scratch that one burning itch that sucking down hemoglobins doesn't scratch. They crave human touch, for they cannot sate their urges among themselves. Carnal relations are forbidden between vampires, another mad rule that got made up somewhere along the way, like avoiding hawthorns and garlic, and is blindly followed just in case the consequences are real, and just as awful as they have been led to believe. The wraiths, wights and spectres will give you a lustful dream so potent that the merest hint of remembrance will see your arousal awaken again and again, but, being non-corporeal, they can only engage with their own kind. There are doctors of medicine and practitioners of other, darker means on hand, who can send you just over the threshold and bring you back again. Most leave very satisfied without noticeable side effects, although some men have later spoken of strange feelings of lusty hardness below, only to find nothing going on between their legs. A phantom limb for the darkly libidinous. The thing in the tank has no discernible form, and as such, neither can it be ascribed a gender, but it will only receive women, for reasons best known to itself, and it is able to bring about their ecstasy in a few brief caresses. No one is quite sure how it works, as the thing refuses to be seen, but smiling, exhausted customers attest that their experience is something like being enveloped in a warm, gently vibrating sponge. Some customers don't return from the tank, however, and their fates remain a mystery. Nobody asks too many questions. It is widely understood that the thing has just as much right to privacy as the women who seek it out. There is one, so ancient she predates the holy books, but you can find her name therein. Age has made her broody. Her price is that you father more of her children, already innumerable. They will sit in their webs and watch you cavort from the shadows, all around her nest, chittering as you sire yet more of their brothers and sisters, their hundreds of red eyes floating in the dark like ghastly stars. Once the deed is done, she ushers you out quickly before the hunger overcomes her. The bones of those who were not swift enough can be seen littering the floor, and caught dangling from sticky, silken strands. There are imps. You might be shocked to see how they make it work, but they do. There are angels and there are demons. There are merfolk and werefolk. There are fae, the fragile and the fallen, and they all await your custom down there by the water's edge. As for myself, I work there too. A night with me is incomparable. The love so great and legendary that only inconsolable grief awaits you when we're done, and in mere days you will wither and die. Is it worth it? The number of callers I receive suggests that it is, but there's only one way to know for sure, isn't there? You know where we are. I'll be waiting.